You can hear me, so I'll continue. Great.
Yeah, now it works.
Fantastic. Thank you. So thanks very much for this invitation. It's wonderful to speak to Scientist Rebellion, and perhaps there are others of you here who aren't members of Scientist Rebellion. I'm Charlie Gardner, and I'm a conservationist. I'm a member of Scientist Rebellion and Scientists for XR in the UK. And I thought I'd try something a bit different today, and I'm going to try and speak without slides. I'm normally, as a scientist, we're used to giving PowerPoint lectures full of data and graphs and charts and references to scientific papers. But I realize this is a Christmas event, so perhaps we don't just want a scientific lecture, but also one of the things I wanted to speak about today is about how we communicate as scientists. And I think one of the reasons we've failed to really bring society along with us in feeling energized and wanting to do something about this planetary emergency is it's because we haven't communicated it very well. So I'd like to try a new form of communication with you today, and I hope you don't get bored of just looking at my face. So ever since I was a young child, I have just wanted to do something to conserve nature. I loved animals, I loved wildlife, and I became a conservation scientist. Even as a young child in the 1980s, I was aware of climate change, but I did what all the rest of us have done, really, and I ignored it. I tried not to think about it. And part of the reason was that I knew it was just so big, so huge that if I allowed myself to think about it, it would, it would take over everything. And I didn't want to think about climate change because I was so occupied with trying to conserve the natural world. And I spent a long time living in Madagascar, trying to conserve tropical biodiversity. And then in 2016, I got a job at the University of Kent in England. And I was asked to teach a course to undergraduates about the impact of climate change on biodiversity, what climate change will do to the natural world. And what I learned teaching that course was so shocking that it made me change my focus from thinking about purely nature to also thinking about climate change, because I realized that if we don't get a handle on climate change, then there's not really any point trying to conserve biodiversity. We can't conserve endangered species in a world where there are no coral reefs and no tropical forests and no ice. And the other thing that really struck me when I was teaching about climate change was I found it incredible that we have had this scientific knowledge for so long, for decades and decades, and yet we were not seeing the kinds of political action we need in response to that knowledge. So it made me think about a lot about, what's the relationship between science and governments, and what scientists can do in this emergency. If purely generating the information isn't enough, what can we do? And so since then, I've been an activist. I left my research career to focus on communicating the science better and trying to catalyze society into making changes on the basis of what the research is telling us. And so over the last few years, this is what I've mainly been working on and thinking about. And I think particularly about how to, I think about why the rest of society and why many of our scientist colleagues and our family and friends and neighbors, why they are not acting with the urgency that is demanded. And that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. Is I'd like to talk about a bit about what we can all do in our lives, in our professional lives, whether we're scientists or not. And in particular, I'd like to speak about why that is important, why it is so critical that we do take these actions that we can. So we're in a planetary emergency, a climate and ecological emergency. So 15,000 scientists have signed an open letter. Um, Could I ask Christina to? Thanks. Um, so 15,000 scientists have signed an open letter declaring that it's a climate emergency. Many countries, like my country, the UK, have declared a climate emergency, and thousands of institutions around the world, including higher education institutions, perhaps your own university, have declared a climate emergency. Um, and they chose this word very, very carefully. We don't call it a climate crisis or a climate problem. We call it an emergency because the word emergency has a very specific meaning. It doesn't only describe a situation, it implies a response. In an emergency, we stop what we are doing and we focus on what needs to be done. In an emergency, we take emergency action. And yet, many of the institutions and governments who have declared an emergency are not taking emergency action. So, to take the example of my country, the UK, for example, a climate emergency in 2019, and we became the first major industrialized country to set a decarbonization target into law. So we created this law that says we must decarbonize by 2050. And that sounds good, but the government has never put in place any policies that will allow them to meet that target. So, for example, they are still opening new oil fields in the North Sea, still giving new licenses for exploration of oil and gas. They tried to open a new coal mine. They are expanding airports. Even the new Labour government that we have since 4 months has said they're going to expand 2 new airports. They are building roads. They are still building new houses to such bad standards that they will have to be retrofitted if we're going to, make them sustainable in the future. So although our governments and it's the same situation around the world, so our governments have said that they are taking this seriously and they've made declarations and they've set distant targets. But when it comes to the actual policies that they're implementing day to day, we are not seeing the kinds of policies that the science says is required, and we're not seeing the kinds of policies that that are popular amongst people, and we're not seeing the kind of policies that are consistent with the targets that governments have made. So we need to ask ourselves, why are governments not doing what they said they would do, and why are they not listening to the scientists who are saying that action is urgent? And the reason is that there are, scientists, we tend to assume that when we speak to governments, when we give advice to governments, we are the only people in the room. So, we have this idea that if we generate information and we provide that information to our governments, then they will use the information to make wise decisions in the public good. What we forget is that, well, governments might not be interested in the public good because they are more interested in electoral politics and economic growth. But in particular, we forget that we are not the only people advising governments. There are also private interests in society that are also interested in the politics, in the policies that governments make. And those private interests are industries. And of course, we can expect industry to be trying to influence the government and trying to prevent the legislation we need. So when the science of climate change was becoming more widely known in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, the best knowledge of climate change wasn't held by government scientists or university scientists. It was held by scientists working for fossil fuel companies. And it was very clear to the fossil fuel companies at that stage that if we were ever to take serious action on climate change, then that would mean the end of the fossil fuel industries. The only possible serious way to address climate change is to bring about the end of the fossil
Well,
fuel were the most powerful, the largest, most powerful industries on the planet. Today, they've been overtaken by tech, but that's that stage they were the largest industries, and they made a decision. They could either, transition to being energy companies instead of being oil companies, or they could try and continue to be oil companies and pump as much oil as they could for as long as possible. And this was the strategy they chose. But of course, this strategy depends on fighting against climate action. And so for the last decades, that is what they have done. And they've done so in two main ways. The first way is to cast doubt about the science, to try to persuade the public that actually climate change isn't so bad or it doesn't need urgent action. And they spent, billions and billions of dollars on a massive disinformation campaign, first to convince people that climate change wasn't happening. Then they moved on to saying, okay, climate change is happening, but it's not happening because of oil. Nowadays, it's impossible to deny climate change. So their narratives have evolved from denial to delay. Instead of saying climate change is not happening, they are saying, okay, it's happening, but there is no reason to act because it will be too expensive, or because it will hurt poor people, or because we will have magical technologies in future that mean we can continue burning oil. So we've moved from denial to delay, but we still have huge, huge misinformation, aviation, construction, road building, tourism, all of these industries, their profitability and their future profitability depends on there not being any environmental legislation, any government legislation that will prevent them from doing their business. So, along with oligarchs and neoliberal fundamentalists, they've invested very heavily in a disinformation campaign so that the public doesn't demand action. The second thing they have done is that they have invested directly in corrupting political processes. They've invested directly in what they call political lobbying or political donations, but to me, it's just corruption. And they spend incredible amounts of money on doing so. So, for example, in the USA, the oil industry alone in most years spends about $125 million on direct donations to politicians, and it spends another $125 million on political lobbying. So there's huge amounts of money being invested directly in preventing the sorts of government action that we need to prevent climate change. So when I was teaching my undergraduate students about why this is happening, why we are not seeing this government action, it became clear to me that my whole way of understanding the world as a scientist was really naive and false. I part of the reason I became a scientist was this idea that if we simply generate the information, if we can find out about what needs to happen and we tell the government, we tell people what needs to happen, then they will do what needs to be done. I thought the relationship between a scientist and the government was a bit like, on a ship in the old days, and the scientist is looking out for danger, and when they see danger, they tell the captain of the ship, and the captain takes action. But clearly, this was very naive because decision making is not about information; it's about power, and it's at the moment it's those that want to prevent political action that have all the power. And that's why citizens and scientists don't. Um, so sociologists who are researching how we can get out of this situation um, frame it in terms of power. And it's clear that if we are to have more influence, if scientists and citizens are to have more influence so that we have policies that reflect the research, then we need to become more powerful. We need to match the power of those that want to prevent change with the power of our own. And of course, we cannot match them in terms of financial power or in terms of um, you know, backroom power, but we can build a power of our own, and that's people power. And that's what scientist rebellion and other social movements are about. So sociologists talk about how, they say that we will only ever get serious action on climate change when we reach social tipping points. Now, this concept of social tipping points, it's not very well developed, but basically it means that change will happen when there are so many people demanding change and making change happen that it becomes inevitable, that there's so much momentum that change becomes inevitable. And I'm very influenced by this research. I think this is what underlies the principle of social movements is the principle of people power and reaching social tipping points. And to understand how we reach social tipping points, we need to understand social contagion. And this is what I really wanted to talk to you about today, about why our climate action matters. It matters because of the most powerful force there is in society, which is social contagion. Now, as human beings, we're social animals. Since long before we were even primates, we were social animals. And as social animals, we look to other people for cues as to how to think and behave. And we do this all the time. If you're in the street and you want to choose which restaurant you want to go and eat in, and you have a choice between one restaurant that's empty and one restaurant that's full, of course you go to the restaurant that's full because you think these other people, they must know something that I don't. These people have chosen this for a reason. I don't have any information about the quality of the restaurant, so all I can do is do what other people are doing because I trust them to be wise. And this social contagion is really, really powerful in influencing what we do. So, research about smokers, for example, cigarette smokers, they find that the number one thing that predicts whether you are a smoker, it's nothing to do with your socioeconomic status or your education or anything. It's simply whether you spent time with people that smoke when you were young. And it's this social contagion that gives me hope as an activist. It's this social contagion that makes that makes me feel powerful, that makes the things that I do powerful. But it's also, I think, a good explanation for why many people don't act. So when we're trying to build a social movement, when we're trying to build a movement of people big enough that we reach social tipping points, we need to think about what stops people from acting on climate change. And as scientists and environmental communicators, we tend to think that the reason people don't act is that they don't have information. They don't know about the problem. They don't yeah, they don't think the problem is bad, so they're not doing anything. So we focus a lot on giving information. We're always telling people, do something. This is serious. You must act. You must do something. But actually, this is a um, it's a bit of a discredited form of communication, and we've known for a long time that simply telling people to do something is not enough to make them act. Um, there was a very influential piece of research carried out by some social psychologists in the 1960s. There was a psychologist by the name of Howard Leventhal, and he was working in Yale University, and he was doing some research about um, the impact of fearful messaging on an audience. If you make your audience very scared with your messaging, will that make them act? So he put together some leaflets about the impact of tetanus, a horrible disease. And he put together a leaflet in two separate versions. One version was full of scary photographs and scary um, descriptions. And then that was the high fear version. And then the other one was just, very mild, no photos, just drawings. And that was the low fear version. And the he gave the leaflets to his experimental groups, and then afterwards he asked them to fill a questionnaire. And as he expected, the very scary version had a bigger impact on the intentions of the students. The students that read the scary version, they were much more likely to say that tetanus is bad, and they were much more likely to say that they wanted to get an inoculation. But of course, if you've ever bought a gym membership, there's a big difference between simply your intention and your actual behavior. So he went back 3 months later to the clinic, the university clinic, and he found out he wanted to see how many students actually went to the clinic to get the inoculation. And what he found was that only 3% of the students actually went there. And there was no difference at all between the high fear group and the low fear group. So he was a bit concerned, all the messaging, it didn't change the behavior of the students. So he went back and he created another two versions of the leaflet, and they were exactly the same, high fear and low fear, but he just added one tiny bit of information. And he increased the inoculation rate from 3% to 27%. It was a huge difference. But the only information he added was he added a map to the clinic and the list of opening times. And the really interesting thing is the students, they already knew where the clinic was, but simply by telling them the next step that they had to do, he made all the difference. So I think this is one reason why people don't take action on climate change, is they don't know what to do. And we need to do better at that as communicators. I think so people know, the thing we are always told that we can do is we need to change our footprints. We need to reduce our personal footprints. And of course, many people want to do that, but and they try to do that, but there's lots of reasons why that approach is limited, and everybody can sense that focusing on our footprints is not good enough. For example, I would love to cycle to my nearest town when I have to go to town, but I can't because the road is too dangerous. It's simply not, I don't want to do it. It's not possible. And that's the situation for many people. It's also the case that, it feels wrong. It feels strange and stupid when we say that the only solution is for us to address our footprints, because it doesn't make sense. First you're saying that everything needs to change. We need to transition our whole societies very, very quickly. But then you are saying that my own contribution is to take the bus instead of driving. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel like emergency action. And then, of course, the other reason why people think that just concentrating on our own footprints is not enough is that it's clearly a distraction. And we only have to remember who first popularized the concept of the personal carbon footprint, which is BP, the oil company. Um, that we can see very clearly that this is a distraction technique to place the blame on us as individuals and deflect away from the attention away from the oil companies. The only other thing that people feel that they can do is when they see on the news that Extinction Rebellion and other groups are going to glue themselves to the road and but of course many people don't want to do that either for all sorts of reasons. They don't identify with these groups or for personal reasons they cannot take that kind of action. So people feel, I think certainly many of the people I've spoken to simply don't know what to do because they don't want to be activists and they know that just acting on their footprints is not enough. But I think there's what that idea, the idea that we can only act on our footprints or campaign against the government, misses out on two very, very important bits of action that all of us can do too. And that's to try and influence other people by speaking to them and to try and change the institutions and communities we're part of, our workplaces and schools and universities. We forget this a lot when we talk about personal change from the bottom or top-down change from the government. We forget that in the middle is every institution and every community, and they have to change too. So I think one of the big reasons why people don't act is because they don't know what to do. And of course, as people that do know what we can do, that gives us particular power to help them, to show the map to the clinic for people that want to do more. But I think the biggest reason that people don't do more is because they think, what is the point? I am only one out of 8 billion people. What's the point? I cannot possibly make any difference if I'm just one person. And this is a very big disincentive to people because we don't do things if we don't think they will work. This is a principle that psychologists refer to as self-efficacy. If we don't have a sense of self-efficacy, we don't do something. For example, if your doctor tells you to take some medicine for your illness, you only do it because you think it will work. Otherwise, there's no point. And I think a lot of people don't try to do things at work, don't try to do things in their life, don't try to change their behavior, don't try to get involved in campaigning. They don't bother to speak to people because they think, I'm just one person, there is no point, I have no power. But of course, that forgets the power of social contagion. If you've ever seen any film about time travel, Back to the Future or anything, or Time Cop, they always talk about how they have to prevent tiny changes in the past because these tiny changes will have huge impacts in the future. Well, this is exactly the same with the things that we do as activists. Their impacts can be multiplied because of the power of social contagion. So I talked a bit about earlier, I mentioned negative social contagion, and I want to start with that first. So some of you might have heard of a famous experiment called the smoky room experiment. This was another experiment carried out in the 1960s by psychologists in the USA. And they so they invited some students to come and attend. They thought they were coming to a meeting, and they put them in a waiting room and they asked them to start filling out a form. And while they were filling out the form, they started pumping smoke underneath the doors. And the students, almost all of them, they noticed the smoke very quickly, and all of them got up to find someone to warn them about it. So they saw that there was a problem, and they immediately acted to take care of the problem. But then they repeated the experiment with actors, and the actors were asked to sit in the room and do nothing. So they were told to notice the smoke, but then just continue filling out their forms. And when this happened, the the students would notice the smoke, and then they would look around them and they would see that nobody else is doing anything. Everybody is calm. Nobody is worried by the smoke. So they would sit there and they think, maybe these people must know something that I don't. They're not worried. They must know something. Of course, I don't want to risk getting up and making a fool of myself. So I'm just going to sit here. And in that situation, the students would sit there for up to 20 minutes while the room filled with smoke. And the only reason they didn't do anything is because nobody else was doing anything. Social contagion. And this is the situation we are in our society. This is exactly the situation we are in our society today. People have heard the news. They see in the newspaper the scientific warnings. And then they leave. They leave the house to go out to work, and they look around them and everybody's calm. Nobody is acting as if this was serious. They go to work, all their colleagues are just carrying on as normal. They go to their lectures, all their university lecturers are just carrying on as normal. And it affects our psychology. How could this be true? If this was true, people would be doing something, but they're not. So it must, I must have misunderstood. So we're in this crazy, just unbelievable situation right now where nobody is taking this seriously purely because nobody else is taking this seriously. It's the social contagion of passivity. And it's really, really serious, but it means that we have incredible power as not just as scientists and as students, but as colleagues, as friends, as family members, as neighbors. We have the power to lift people out of their passivity by becoming active. When everybody was in that room full of smoke and nobody was moving, if one person shouted fire and started to run, then everybody else would shout fire, would run. And it's clear that, of course, as social animals, we don't judge danger based on rationality. We judge danger socially. Think about what happens. I can see lots of you in that room now. If the fire alarm went off now, it's not the fire alarm you would respond to, it's other people. When you hear the fire alarm, you look around you. If other people are scared, you run. If other people are calm, you don't. And it's because we're not acting that we send this example to other people that this is nothing to worry about. And it's particularly so for us, because as scientists, as students, as people who are concerned about the environment, when our friends all see us as my environmental friend, you are the green one, you are the environmentalist one for your friends. So this is why, acting seriously is so powerful. This is why, we talked about um, reducing our footprints. Now, we all know that transitioning to a plant-based diet is a very, very important thing for society to do. But we also know that, one meal that you have doesn't make a difference. If you eat one beef burger, yes, that's 1,000 liters of water and 9 kilos of emissions, but it's nothing really. But the power of eating a plant-based burger, the value of eating a plant-based burger instead of a beef burger is not the emissions you save, and it's not the water you save, it's the social signal that you send to other people. Every time you engage in a pro-climate or a pro-environmental behavior, you are sending a signal. You are saying, this thing is important enough for me to change my behavior. On the other hand, every time you every time you choose the standard behavior instead of the pro climate behavior, you are also sending a signal. You are sending a very negative signal. You are sending a signal that everything is okay. I am satisfied with the status quo. This is not enough for me to change my behavior. And that's why it's so important, I think, that environmentalists and climate people do change their diets and do stop flying and do the visible things that we do, because otherwise we're sending such a terrible signal to other people. If even my environmentalist friends don't change their behavior, then this must be bullshit. If it's not serious enough for them to change, why should I change? And that's what makes all our behavior really, really important. Um, the wonderful thing about it is that we can change that. We can, we are influential people. We influence the people that we meet. We influence the people we know. And by talking about climate, by acting on climate, by talking about nature, we serve to normalize these things for other people. Caring about the environment, caring about nature it's not something that most people actively do. They think that is a weird thing. That is for hippies and scientists and environmentalists. That's for left-wing people. That's that's not for me. What we know about this transition we have to make is that we will only we will only make this transition when we reach social tipping points, when enough people are environmentalists, essentially, when everybody is acting for the environment. And in other words, we have to move from being a small niche concern for one tiny part of society to being a big concern for all of society. And the great news is that with the magic of social contagion and social tipping points, that can happen very, very fast. So I'd just like to leave you with one story, which for me really highlights just how powerful we all are as individuals in helping build momentum towards social tipping points. And so I'd like you to imagine that you are at a party or a festival or a concert, and there's wonderful music. You've had some wine or something, and you want to dance, but nobody is dancing. So of course you're not going to just get up and start shaking in front of everybody. But soon somebody does start to dance, and you're a bit more tempted, but they're a much better dancer than you, or worse, they're a bit weird and strange. So still you hold back. I don't want to go and dance with the crazy dancer. But then, a couple of other people start to dance as well, and it changes the whole atmosphere. Suddenly you feel liberated by the safety in numbers, and so you feel able, you feel comfortable to get up and start dancing. But at some point, if the music is really good and the atmosphere is really good, an amazing thing can happen where so many people start dancing that you reach a point, a tipping point, where even the people that didn't want to dance, now they get drawn in. Maybe, maybe they don't like dancing, they didn't want to dance, but they feel they're missing out on something, or now they feel strange. They feel strange and weird being the only person standing at the back against the wall. So they start to dance. And in no time at all, first dancing was weird and scary, but then it became accepted, and then it became expected. And it all happens because of the power of the second and third dancer. Now, nobody's asking you as a nobody's asking you or your neighbors or your family to um to be the first dancer on the dance floor. You don't have to be the first dancer on the dance floor, because the scientists and Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion are already the first dancer. But when you step up in your workplace and in your community and in your family and say, these guys are right, and when you start taking action in your life and in your workplace, you are the second and third dancer. You validate those crazy first dancer. You turn the crazy weirdo into a crowd. And the second and third dancer have so much power to turn the lone weirdo into a crowd. And that's a power that all of us, I think, have. And I think once you realize this power that we have as contagious agents, sorry to use viral terminology, but our behavior is contagious, and that gives us power, that gives us a responsibility. Remember this, we cannot avoid the power of social contagion, because if we don't act, we are saying everything's okay. So we need to recognize our power and use it for good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie. I think as brilliant as 2 years before I heard your talk. I think we want to try to at least have some questions. We have this microphone here, so we try again maybe. And this one? Okay, this is just.
It's not loud
Can
enough.
you do something now?
Charlie, can you hear me?
Hello.
Oh, hi. Perfect. Now it works. How much time do you have for Q&A?
Um, as long as you like, really. Well, let's say no more than 20 minutes, because I'm at a friend's house, and
Okay, no problem. Thanks so much for the Sustainability Club. It was a wonderful, inspiring talk, and I'm sure people have some questions. And maybe I'll start with my own. Actually, it was my partner who inspired me initially to join this community of weird dancers, let's say, and his own approach or his own vision on how to talk people or to educate or to give an example is that to do uninvasively. And also one thing that he tells and he shares that different people requires different approach essentially, and some people they can require so much effort and they are so unwilling to change that maybe it's not worth it to even approach them. So I'm wondering what kind of opinion you have on this. Do you have some universal formula on how to talk with all people, or you also tend to think that some people are like easier, to start working with and to spend our time with them to educate them about the problems?
yeah, this is a brilliant question. And I think often we go about it all wrong. You know, as people who come from a science background and people who tends to think rationally about evaluating evidence and things, we tend to think that the way to communicate with people is through giving them information. But actually, emotion is much more powerful. Our emotional brain is much more powerful than our rational brain. So the first thing, well, one thing I think is it's not about giving information, it's about understanding the barriers that the person you're speaking to faces. So you know, it's not like they've never heard this stuff before. Of course, they have heard that we have a crisis, but for one reason or other, they have told themselves a story about why they do not have to act. Maybe they think that the government is in control. Maybe they think that technology will. Maybe they think that this is only something that left-wing people care about and they are conservative. Maybe they think it's, so it could be identity issues or whatever. The point is that whatever the barrier that they have created, you will never be able to overcome that barrier with another fact about polar bears or another fact about agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, because it's not an information deficit problem. So I think the very first thing always is not to say anything, but to listen, ask questions, listen, understand where that person is coming from, understand what it is that they are that they are concerned about, and then adjust your message directly to the barriers they have instead of whatever. So once you understand what their barriers are, you can overcome them. It also helps to understand what people care about, because because this affects everything. So if we are just talking about nature or famine, but they hate nature, then that won't make a difference. But if they love sport or if they love fishing, then talk to them about the impacts of climate change on fishing. Meet them at their place and talk about, and not just shared interests, but also shared values. Now, so we tend to think about climate change as something that's more of a concern for left-wing people, and right-wing people don't care about it. But actually, I think it's lots of climate action is also meets conservative values. Trying to maintain the things we love is a conservative value. Trying to save for the future of your children is a conservative value. Trying to show fiscal responsibility is a conservative value. So I think, try to understand people and meet them where they are, not where you are. Tell stories instead of facts, and use emotions instead of facts. Also, one thing is, highlight the benefits. We talk a lot about, we always talk about how terrible climate change will be if we don't do something, but all the action we have to do will make things better. So we can talk about, how we will have warm homes in the future and nice streets with no cars, and how, our food will be better. Everything will be better if we take climate action. And that's very attractive, to move towards something nice instead of moving away from something scary. Could I just say the microphone in the room is not very clear. I had quite difficulty hearing that last question. Sorry.
Sorry.
Anything in Zoom?
No.
So any questions? Yes. Let's microphone again. Do you hear me now? No?
I can hear, but it's not super clear.
It's there, I think.
Yep.
But maybe the
Maybe if you
microphone.
can speak to the screen, it will be
But I think
easier.
it's actually the
Okay,
microphone.
like
but
this. Just very be loud.
With the microphone and on.
yeah,
Yes,
try
okay.
both. I think it's the
So-
microphone actually, but
Is it working now? Yes. Hi. So thank you so much for your talk. I have a question regarding you mentioned power, social contagion. How do you then create trust? Because they are very important forces that are actually at play and using their power to actually prevent trust in people who want to change things. And for example, I have a very recent example with Paul Watson and the Sea Shepherd, and what's happening in Iceland, Norway, Japan. And there are very strong emotions, there are very strong values, but there are also the role of governments at play. So how, for example, what is your point of view on that, and what would be your advice on how to discuss and perhaps change things? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a great question. Trust is trust is a necessary condition. I think you're right in identifying trust as a necessary condition. And I think destroying trust has been one of the tactics that that the oil industry and others that want to prevent change have used. They have destroyed trust in scientists by creating doubt about the science through this disinformation campaign. They've also destroyed trust in governments. That's something that that's part of the broader neoliberal project to destroy trust in government. So we reduce government regulation, and of course the media try to destroy any trust in activists through their portrayal of us as in the media. They portray us as bad people. Fortunately, the most powerful way whilst trust in science and trust in government have been destroyed, the one form of trust that cannot be destroyed is interpersonal trust between people. And that's why that's part of what gives us power as activists. That's part of what makes talking about it so important, and why I always say that talking about it is one of the most important things we can do, is because people have lost their trust in the media, they've lost their trust in scientists, they lost their trust in government. They don't know who to believe. The one group of people that we do know who to believe and who to trust is our friends and family and the people like us. So there's a global survey of trust called the Edelman Trust Barometer. And happily, it shows that the most trusted group in society is still scientists. But there's one other group of people that is almost as trusted as scientists, and that's people like me. And that means that whoever you are, you can influence the people around you, because although they don't trust the media and they don't trust the government, they do trust you. And that means that if we speak up, if we start speaking about these things, not in terms of facts, not in terms of parts per million and 1.5 degrees, but in terms of just open yourself up as a vulnerable person. I am scared. I'm worried. I want to do something. That vulnerability, that being a real person, that is how you build trust between people. And in a world where trust in institutions is being destroyed, we really have to build trust between people, and that's what social taking part in a social movement is partially about.
Thank you, Charlie. That was a nice answer, I think. Any more questions, maybe?
Hello. Yeah, I mean, put microphone clear from camera. So you talked about kind of how being vegan or not taking the plane, how we can send positive social signals through that and be kind of, yeah, contagious for others. But also we have people on the other hand who fly a lot or eat a lot of meat or are fascists. And somehow they seem to be better at communicating or be like social, sending out the social signals than we are. So I was wondering, what is your take on that, or kind of at least looking at kind of election results? I don't get too much hope only from sending out social signals. So I wanted to know kind of what your take on that is. And thanks for the talk, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, this is a real concern. You know, the rise of denialism, the rise of right wing politics and right-wing sentiment in society, and especially the rise of like antisocial sentiment in society. You know, it's whereas we used to have social norms which were much more about caring and looking after each other, now they're becoming increasingly isolationist, and it's increasingly all about just me and don't care about the rest of society. Yes, I think you're right. These things are on the rise. And I think your analysis is correct. I think so. Partially, this is because our opponents understand social norms better than us, and they understand social contagion better than us, and they have manipulated that to a huge extent. So take, for example, Twitter, where a lot of journalists and a lot of media professionals get their view of society. So, you know, right-wing forces in, whoever they are, but they've been investing heavily in changing social norms. One of the ways they've done that on social media is by creating bots. When you have a extreme fascist idea, an extreme idea about expelling immigrants or something, it's an extreme idea, and nobody shares it. But if you create hundreds or thousands of bots on Twitter, fake accounts that share this idea, then suddenly the idea looks much more popular than it is, and everybody goes, "Ooh, lots of other people are thinking this. Maybe I should think this too. This seems to be a popular thing now." But that's artificial. It's created. It's not real people sharing that view. It's just fake accounts. But the reason why those fake accounts were created, it's expensive to do that. But the reason why they were created was to shift the public consciousness towards the rights, to shift the Overton window by making it seem like extreme radical ideas are more popular than they are. So yes, you're right that that this is happening, and that our opponents are one step ahead of us. But it's also it's sort of reassuring that all this growth in right-wing sentiment, it's not organic growth. It is it is created, it is manufactured. And yeah, how we fight it, I don't know, other than being louder and more insistent advocates and activists ourselves. And, you know, so part of it is people hear anti-climate messages all the time on the newspaper, on the TV studio, on social media. They are always hearing these messages saying it's nothing to worry about, it's nothing to worry about, it's bullshit. And us in our private lives, we stay silent. We don't want to start these conversations because they're controversial and it's difficult, so we stay silent. But that means we're not doing anything to counter the message. So the message takes hold. So I think, you know, breaking the silence, actively calling out the nonsense when we see it, it's the only thing we can do is just be loud, I think, and don't hold back. But that was a great question. Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more question, at least.
Yes, thank you, sorry for the nice talk. I liked a lot the example you took about dancing.
I'm so sorry. Could you please go to the laptop, please? I can't really hear.
Is it better now?
Perfect, yes.
Okay. I liked a lot the example you took about dancing, and like first they're a bit like the weird people and then the mass joins kind of. But I feel like this is a very like tangible, socially visible example. How do you make this happen with something way bigger and way more complex as like climate change, where people maybe are like, okay, I'm in to join, but then they're like, yeah, I'm not really seeing the results, so then maybe get discouraged faster. You know, I don't know if you see a little bit what I mean, but I feel like it's such a bigger and more complex issue than just like getting people on stage, basically.
It is, of course, it is. But these social changes happen very, very quickly. You know, in the past, it was completely acceptable for people to be racist, and then it became unacceptable to be racist. And it happened because of social forces, you know, people making it clear that behavior was changing, people making it clear that old behaviors are not longer acceptable anymore, and making it clear that the new behaviors are desirable and normalizing them. I do think that it's much easier if we have some top-down forces encouraging us to change our behavior. So this is why we have a sort of a chicken and egg situation. We need lots of people to force government action, but also we need government leadership to encourage people to change their behavior. But the good news is I think it can happen very fast if and I think so COVID was an excellent example of that, you know, because we saw two, not one, but two very, very rapid behavior changes. At the beginning, when we went into lockdowns, lots of things that everybody said were impossible, they happened. You know, people stayed at home, governments, all the money that governments never said was available, they were suddenly available everywhere. Everything changed very quickly, and people were happy to stay at home. You know, if in 2017 someone had asked, can you imagine a situation where people will be happy to stay at home for 2 months without going out? It's impossible to imagine, but it did happen when we treated an emergency like the emergency that it is. When the government and people treated it like an emergency, we did amazing things. Then things started to change. And, you know, there was, of course, a big interest in opening up the economy anymore. So all all the narrative in the media and the narrative from government changed completely. For the first 2 months, the narrative was everybody, we have to make sacrifices to look after the vulnerable and to look after our healthcare workers. And, you know, in the UK, everybody came out at night to applaud all the healthcare workers. The narrative was all about looking after each other and taking care of each other. Within a couple of months, it completely changed. It was all about get back to normal. Masks don't work. There's no need to have masks. There's no need to look out for each other. Just look out for yourself. And instead of all this pro-social behavior, the narrative was now promoting anti-social behavior. But what's incredible, and yes, it's true that the governments were the government and the media were promoting this, but I just think it's extraordinary how quickly the public narrative changed, how quickly behavior changed from pro-social to anti-social. And you know, that was a bad thing, but it's just to illustrate the rapidity, how quickly the behavior can change across a society. Now, of course, that was change from the top down, not from the bottom up, not from people. But I think, you know, the example of anti-racism, that's a change from the bottom up. The example of how the position of women has changed over society over the last decades. Of course, it has not come far enough, but it has come very, very far. And that has happened not because of government mandates, not because of institutional mandates, but because of bottom-up social and behavior change, and then the institutions follow. So it can and does happen. Our challenge now is to make it happen much, much faster. And of course, the changes needed are much, much bigger. So while we don't have exact examples of where such changes have been successful before, of course we don't. We've never faced a challenge like this. However, I think the mechanism of social contagion remains, for me, the best model for working out how we can build a big enough momentum, big enough people power to make the change we need.
Thank you, Charlie. Looking at the time, I think we should take more time of you, and this was great. I think questions were great, the answers were great, the presentation as well. So thank you a lot, and have a nice evening.
Thanks.
I will
Thanks
close
for
this
having me. I'm really honored for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Charlie.